Welcome to our May 12th webinar on the revitalization of nuclear for energy. Most of us in our lifetime have experienced the roller coaster ride of promises, problems with nuclear. Since World War II, nuclear is meant for the general public, the atomic bomb, threats of annihilation and radioactivity. Think 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. But nuclear for energy has meant so much more. A virtually inexhaustible source of energy valued today for its low GHG emissions, but suspect for the high cost of production, lengthy construction overruns, issues of security, and how to dispose of radioactive waste. But that was then, and this is now. Nuclear social license is apparently being restored. Think Europe. And well, let's hear from each of our distinguished presenters, their views. Rob Norris will be our moderator today, so over to you, Rob. And Rob, please share with us a little bit of your background in energy.
Great, thanks very much. And I'm just honored to be here with such an august group, and especially on such a relevant and urgent topic. I grew up in Red Deer and moved to Saskatchewan in the kind of mid 1990s for what I thought was going to be a year of school, and really it opened my eyes to the significance of Canada's position and standing in the world as it relates to uranium resources, and then obviously part of that value chain when we look to provinces, traditionally Ontario or New Brunswick, about power generation. I had the privilege of serving in Brad Wall's government as the Minister of Advanced Education, Employment, Labor, Immigration, Innovation, and SAS Power. It was those last two responsibilities that allowed me to work with our Premier and work with stakeholders from across the province and across the country, some of whom are on this call, as we put in place a nuclear research strategy that came out of direct feedback. And when we think about the prairies, for example, we can think about value-added agriculture and how significant that is. What we noticed is that wasn't the tone or the approach when it came to uranium. And we wanted to play a role in helping to ensure that there was a greater dialogue on that value chain and what that meant for Canadians, and certainly what it meant within the context of Saskatchewan. So I'm delighted to be here. I guess I would offer just a couple of things. Robert Zoellick has many of you will know, he's the former president of the World Bank. He's recently just come out with a new article, Before the Next Shock. It's in Foreign Affairs of March and April 2022. And essentially he says, the world is in the early stages of a vast and likely discontinuous energy transition that will match the Industrial Revolution in its hard to anticipate effects. And Steve Polas has just come out, former governor of the Bank of Canada, and said essentially a lot of this transition is going to require political engagement and depend on political decisions. And so part of what we're talking about is technology, but part of it is public policy, and a lot of it is going to be determined through perceptions, communications, and engagement. And it speaks to some of that legacy, Barry, that you brought forward. Today, obviously, we've got really rare, terrific speakers to offer, I think, to illuminate some key features. And so without further ado, Morgan, if we could ask you to draw on your expertise in nuclear systems, nuclear safety, and to really help provide a bit of an overview for where the sector is today.
So thank you very much. I'd like to talk today a very brief introduction to Canada's nuclear story. And that's me. I'm a research engineer and also involved with a couple of other nuclear organizations in Canada. I've been doing nuclear stuff for some 33 years. So climate and greenhouse gases, it's time to step up. That's our electric car. You can see the prices down there for what it takes to fill it up. And we just love it. And electric cars are really going to be something of the future, and they are part of the present. But we want to increase the electrification. How do we do it? There's no easy solutions. The best hydro sites have already been developed. More remote sites are being built. Wind and solar, they're cheap to build, but they have low capacity factors. They're useful, but they're capricious, and building more doesn't fill the gap. Wind and solar need large scale storage. There's a very large facility in China, which would store about 5.5 minutes of Alberta's production. Solar has its place, but it has a capacity factor in the order of 18%. You can see it changes from winter to summer. And the bottom two graphs show actually hour of the day charts. And there are large error bars on them, or as the amount of production changes over the days that you can't count on it, in other words. Wind has its place, definitely. But again, you can see seasonal variation, and the bottom one shows the sort of hour by hour variation over 72 hours. This is all Ontario data. And you can see it's very difficult for grids to cope with such variability. So what about nuclear? Well, since 1962, 25 Canadian CANDU reactors have produced 3.5 billion megawatts net, and that's about 5.5 years of Canadian electrical production, and virtually no greenhouse gases. 19 of those CANDUs are currently in operation or are being refurbished. Their capacity factor is around 80%. So that's, continuous baseload operation, and they go out every now and then for scheduled maintenance outages. And that 3.5 billion megawatts hours, if it was from coal, which was the main alternative, it would have produced in the order of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2. That's around 4 years worth of our entire country's CO2 production. Coal also produces a great deal of ash and particulates, all sorts of other wastes. And another 1.1 billion megawatt hours to date have been produced by 12 CANDUs, which have been built internationally. And that's not including 18 variants of that in India. So I'm unashamedly proud of the CANDU reactor. And it was one of the top 10 engineering achievements of the past century. And I'd like to emphasize, we are not a sunset industry. And thinking of that, here's a graph to show you. The pink line was produced in 2003 by Campaign for Nuclear Phase Out, who obviously don't like nuclear. And yet in the gray to the right, you can see that's the difference between their predictions and what was actually produced in Canada by nuclear reactors. So we're not quite dead yet. Now, I always like to go back and show a little bit of Canadian nuclear history. So we start with Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealander, who came in 1898 to McGill University and described radioactivity and half-life, and he won the Nobel Prize for this. He won it in 1908 when he was actually now a professor in Britain, so they claimed the prize. But in 1930, this man, Gilbert Labine, and his brother Charles, discovered uranium and started mining it up in the Northwest Territories. And at that time, it had no purpose really other than extracting small amounts of radium from within the uranium and using it for treating cancer. And they built a Port Hope refinery where they did their processing. That's a picture of now with uranium mining in Canada. That's Cigar Lake in northern Saskatchewan. Is the highest grade ore in the world. And just yesterday I read that their output planned for this year will be the largest single operation in the world of a mine. And Canada typically produces somewhere between 1/7 and 1/5 of the world's supply of uranium. Scrolling on now to 1939, in the middle there, you have Otto Hahn in his laboratory in Berlin. He was a exceedingly talented chemist. He bombarded uranium and he had these unusual chemical results. So he sent his work off to Lise Meitner, who's also shown in that picture. She was a refugee scientist in Stockholm at the time, having escaped Nazi Germany. And she looked at it with her nephew, Otto Frisch, and they realized what was happening. Somehow, uranium was being split apart and a tremendous amount of energy was being released with it. So she and Otto wrote to the journal Nature in February 1939, and it's, announcing fission to the world. This was great news. Physicists all over the world got very excited about this, started to do these experiments, started to trade notes, and then war came along. That cut off all the communication. In Canada, one of the people working on that early use of uranium was this fellow, George Lawrence from Charlottetown originally. He was working at the National Research Council in Ottawa, and he did the first large-scale experiments with uranium in the world. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, a committee there concluded that atomic weapons were feasible. And there were several European refugee scientists who had escaped from France, and they'd ended up in Cambridge, carrying on their research there with British scientists. And the UK at the time was the leader in the world of knowledge about radiation and uranium. After the Pearl Harbor attack, the US moved very quickly with their Manhattan Project and soon overtook the UK in terms of knowledge. And the UK and the USA proposed to move the UK project from Britain to Canada with the National Research Council to support them. And they set up the Montreal laboratories, thanks to this guy saying, okay, let's go. And the Montreal laboratories, founded with these European, British, and now Canadian scientists, it evolved eventually into the Chalk River laboratories within a couple of years. And that's where I work now. South of the border at the time, another refugee scientist, Enrico Fermi, he and his team built the world's first nuclear reactor. It was moderated with graphite. But Canada's focus was on heavy water, and it was known to be the best moderator in theory back in 1939. And in fact, the US persuaded Cominco to build a heavy water or D2O production facility actually under the noses of the Canadian government. They didn't realize about it. The Americans built a reactor. They were called piles back then. And it was the first one in the world with heavy water and natural uranium. They didn't need any enrichment. And it first operated in 1944. But by that point, the Americans had graphite reactors that were already producing plutonium. And so they said, fine, let the Canadians work with heavy water. And that led to Zero Energy Experimental Pile, the first reactor outside the United States built at Chalk River. It took about a year to design and build. And that fellow in the bottom right corner, Lou Kowarski, he was one of these refugee scientists, and he was the lead physicist behind the design of this. George Klein from the National Research Council was very much involved. He did the mechanical design of the reactor. Very successful scientific tool, which lasted until 1970, doing great service. So in 1945, Canada had the second largest nuclear infrastructure on the planet. ZEEP Works, the world's most powerful research reactor, NRX, was already under construction. It took another couple of years before it first operated. We were world experts on heavy water, and we had uranium. From those early beginnings, AECL, as the Chalk River Laboratories eventually became, they had 3 large research reactors built over the years. They're all shut down now. The first 2, NRX and NRU at Chalk River, and WR1 at the Manitoba, the Whiteshell Laboratories in Manitoba. Now this fellow, Wilfred Bennett Lewis, he came in 1946 as the head of R&D at AECL, and he was the driving force behind applying this new nuclear science to electricity production. And The Canadian program built on its expertise, natural uranium and heavy water. In 1962, this was the result. The NPD, or Nuclear Power Demonstration Reactor, worked very successfully for 25 years. It was small, but it not only was a prototype, it also was a research reactor. And you can see in front of that picture, it looks like a school. There's a large training center there. NPD led to another 24 power reactors in Canada. They're CANDU design. And of these 25, 19 are still in operation or are being refurbished at present. It also led to another 12 reactors around the world, 12 CANDUs, of which most of them are still in operation. And so what's the current status of nuclear power generation? Well, the company Ontario Power Generation, which took over from Ontario Hydro in the 1990s, they are refurbishing the 4 units at Darlington, and they are on budget and on time. One of the units is completed and is up and running again. Their final shutdown is planned for 2055. Their Pickering units, which were the first big station in Canada, they're not planning to refurbish, and shutdown is planned in a couple of years. Bruce Power leased a site from OPG with 8 reactors. They restarted 2 units, they refurbished another 2, and they're now refurbishing 6 of them. And one of them is already in the process now. Again, on budget, on time. These are huge projects, and their final shutdown is planned for 2064. New Brunswick Power has one large CANDU. It was refurbished in 2012, and they expect to have 30 to 35 years life out of it. Now, small modular reactors will be covered by Bob, so I'll just give a brief overview. There are 10+2 design reviews underway with our regulator, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The federal government is very much in favor of SMRs, as they're called. There's an action plan, you can read it online. OPG is planning to build a unit, and Saskatchewan may follow suit with the same design. New Brunswick Power is working with a couple of vendors, and a prototype, a small one, is planned for Chalk River. It's a 5 megawatt reactor. There's an enlargement of the reactor core itself, and it uses some fabulous, I was going to say new fuel. It's certainly new to Canada. It's a very robust fuel, behaves absolutely superbly, even under the worst conditions. Talking about waste, which is a topic which always comes up, for me, spent fuel is a big plus of nuclear power. Radiation is easily detected, way below levels that can cause harm. Spent fuel is solid and compact, and it contains all its waste in a small contained volume. Radiation fields continuously decline. And in fact, even spent fuel could be safely handled after a few centuries. At Chalk River, they're planning the near surface disposal facility for low-level waste, the biggest volume of which is demolition waste, but also waste from non-ACL and non-CNL sources, so it could be university and hospital waste. They are proposing to bury in situ WR1 and NPD reactors. And the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is undertaking the long process to select a volunteer community for their deep geological repository for spent fuel. So, are perceptions changing? I've been watching this industry and been part of it for a long time. I believe those perceptions are improving. And so I'd like to welcome you to the future while learning from the past. Thank you.
Morgan, that was instructive and compelling. You've given us a sketch of the past. Obviously, being here in Saskatoon, I wanted to add in the name CJ McKenzie, former Dean of Engineering, who would go on to be, if I'm not mistaken, I think the first president of Atomic Energy Canada. And
That's correct.
yeah, anyway, it's very helpful to see, and a good reminder, the leadership role that Canada played. That notion of functionalism when we think about Canadian foreign policy. Within key niches, Canada was a trusted partner at the most important of tables, and you've highlighted that, the legacy of what that expertise continues to offer Canadians as far as energy security. So, boy, I found that very compelling. And Bob, to hear from you, obviously, your extensive executive experience, ACL, and so much more. We'd really like to just continue on. Where are we going with SMRs? Continuity and change, it seems to me, is upon us.
Yeah, so Morgan set this up nicely. So I'm going to be talking about where we are and where the future is going. While I'm going to have a certain Canadian perspective, I have to say many of my remarks are intended to provide more of a global perspective. This is a global challenge we have here, and Canada has an opportunity to play into that big time. SMRs are going to play into my discussion. It's somewhat of a larger discussion as well. So let me just say right up front, here's my bottom line. And the 7 points I make here is what I'm going to talk. I've got a slide or two in each of those, get through this in 20 minutes. So to Morgan's point, Canada has legitimacy in the nuclear energy space. We know this, and we don't have the baggage of having nuclear weapons. The climate emergency is big, it's scary. We need lots of nuclear energy. We also need lots of variable renewables. We've got to get out of the habit of trying to eat each other's lunch in this space. Nuclear actually complements and enables variable renewables, wind and solar. We're on the cusp of yet another major innovation in nuclear technology. I'll talk about that. SMRs are part of it. It's more. We brand it nuclear. SMRs come into this. Yes, we talk about cost of production and speed of production, but that's not the real value proposition around SMRs. I'll explain that. It's this idea of being a multi-tool in the energy system of the world, but it's not the old business model. SMRs require some fundamental rethink, particularly in economics and in what I call systems thinking. And then one comes back to the big, scary change. What I'm used to talking to people about now, if you look at growing the footprint of nuclear globally so that it's upwards of 20% of the global energy system, we need about 10,000 or more new nuclear reactors in the next 30 years. 10,000, a scary number. And just to be controversial, a comment that some of you may have heard I made last week, we have a hesitant public when it comes to nuclear, and I'm going to be controversial. We don't have a waste problem. We have a trust problem. So let's get into this. One slide to do what, why is that? To do what Morgan has done. We are a Tier 1 nuclear nation. Rob, thanks to Saskatchewan, you're providing the world and Canada with the richest uranium in the world. Thank you. My kids say thank you. My grandkids say thank you. We have our big operating nuclear generating stations. Bruce is the largest in the world. We have our homegrown technology. The Canadian Nuclear Laboratories are the largest science and technology complex in Canada, and we have a science-based regulator that knows its business. So we know what we're talking about here. When we come back to this climate emergency and my comment about we have a big change ahead of us, when we look at the climate emergency, two comments. The evidence is stark. The challenge is unprecedented. Our world is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, energy systems, the economy. 83% of today's energy comes from fossil fuels, 4% nuclear. I'm talking about energy, not just electricity. Electricity is about 30% of the global energy system. And we're continuing to grow demand. As populations grow, as demand for economic growth pulls demand. And our climate scientists are pretty unanimous. If we don't get off our GHG emissions, the world is going to be a pretty scary place. I am enormously concerned for my 9 grandchildren and their children. And there is no one solution. There is no silver bullet. We need it all. There are, in fact, multiple transitions required here. There's about a transition to decarbonize energy production, and in particular electricity production, and then grow it, the clean electricity path. There's a need to decarbonize end use, transportation, heating, industry uses, and there's a need to pull back on demand through conservation. And importantly, while getting off GHG emissions is the goal here, there's other things that have to be accomplished at the same time. Geopolitical, socioeconomic, externalities such as waste, and of course, as the war in Ukraine has brought into top of mind again, energy security. There's an emerging consensus on kind of the elements that need to be achieved to get there. There are certainly policy perspectives such as the price on carbon and ideas such as responsible investment. But the broad 2 pathways are to ramp up clean electricity, and the second is to go to a clean fuel substitution, perhaps based on hydrogen. So there is a consensus emerging, but wow, is it tough, and there's big infrastructure investments required. Yeah. So if we come back into this theme around nuclear being on the cusp of a new technological generation, the chart here is a bit dated, but in our industry, we tend to talk about these generations of nuclear reactors. We're currently seeing, if you look around the reactors that are to be coming into service today, they're what are called Gen 3 plus. All the reactors for Gen 1 and Gen 2 relied on what's called active safety. In other words, they needed pumps and whatnot to actually, with auxiliary power from off-site to be able to control the reactor. The key difference, and I can't state this enough, from Gen 3 on is that Eureka, where these reactors are now in what are called inherently safe or passively safe. You shut off the system, you shut off all electricity to the site, the reactor goes to 0 power. Enormously important. Yes, we're seeing the possibility of what are called Generation 4 reactors coming online. These move away from water as both a moderator and heat transport system into other technologies, and we can talk about that in a moment. But if we come back to where are we going with this, what does the International Panel on Climate Change, what does the International Energy Agency say about nuclear? The first thing is keep those current fleets going as long as you can. Get on with the new builds that are currently planned. The big reactor builds, I say they're all Generation 3, Generation 3 plus, and this transition to this new nuclear energy brand. It's about getting the costs and time of construction down, simpler designs. It's about being compatible with wind and solar, looking beyond electricity and getting waste streams down. That's really where we're focused in Canada. The 2 sides about keep the fleet going. Morgan's talked about refurbishing Bruce, Darlington, Port Lepro, and we are shutting down Pickering. It just does not make economic sense to refurbish those reactors. And a big focus on the small part of new nuclear. I would also highlight, and I'll just take a pause, that new nuclear is also about large reactors. It's also about those Gen 3 reactors, but it's not just about electricity, and it's not just about base load. It's about adding in energy storage and load following so it can work with variable renewables. In Canada, we have a roadmap. Rob would know this well. We have an action plan, and we are going forward with demonstrations and Morgan's already highlighted. Those are mixes of Gen 3 and Gen 4 designs. And then what is this about? It's 3 things coming together, a convergence of 3 game-changing advances in this technology. One I've already spoken about, and that is the guts of the reactor itself moving into these Generation 3 and 4 designs. These give a capability to operate reactors from a megawatt up to 1.5 gigawatts. And to do so with temperatures that run from 300 degrees Celsius up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Not one design, these are different designs, but enormously broad. About small modular reactors, this is about the way you construct them. It's the way you factory produce them. It's about standardization, harmonization of regulation, get the cost down, get the speed of manufacturing down. That's not all of it, however. It's also about what the reactor is connected to. It's the balance of plant. It's about going to cogen, using the heat and the electricity, going to dispatchability or load following. It's about compatibility with renewables. All that coming together is a new paradigm. That leads, in the particular case of SMRs, to a new value proposition, what I like to call the energy systems multi-tool. On the left-hand side, off screen, you have a reactor. An SMR, this one happens to be a Canadian design by a company called Terrestrial. It's a molten salt design. It produces molten salt running at about 600 degrees. There are numerous designs. But really, in my view, the magic occurs in what these designs are connected to, some mix of these balance of plant features that allows it to directly create electrons for power generation, to couple to thermal storage, actually using concentrated solar technology that gives you the ability to turn those that heat into electricity when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, and finally to use the heat directly for chemical synthesis, such as hydrogen production, or into elements such as desalination. The magic then occurs because you have these markets that run from grid power, including the opportunity to help renewables, to heavy industry, and finally to remote communities. Now, the bands I've got here are notional. There's certainly, like the oil sands, as Axel would know, has a higher demand than what I would indicate here, and it needs a very high temperature reactor as well. The bottom line here is that you see with all of that, you have the opportunity to provide contributions to clean electrification, to clean fuel substitution, to energy storage, and you do it with high-paying jobs. And you also help energy security in northern communities, a just transition. However, there are considerations that need to be taken into account. This is not just large nuclear in a smaller footprint. In particular, let's look at the economic model when it comes to construction. The large reactors are based on the concept of economies of scale. Get the reactor as big as it possibly can be, because all of the infrastructure around it, it doesn't escalate in cost as quickly as the reactor benefit does. So you get a lower cost of construction per unit energy the larger the reactor is. And you see what the large reactors that are being built today are between 1 and 1.5 gigawatt electric. The concept of SMRs turns this concept on its head. And it says we want to get to low construction cost per unit energy produced through a combination of the four factors I see on the left here. You see on the left. It's about modularization and factory build. Plus, it's about design simplification. Plus, it's about standardization. Plus, it's about harmonization of the regulatory frameworks. So what do you get with this? You get global fleets. Think about the airline industry. It's a great equivalence here, and therefore you're able to get those costs down. And oh, by the way, a simpler design, factory production, you get the construction times down. That's the concept. The second, however, is you have to look at this through a systems perspective. And yes, we often come back and talk about the SMR and its balance of plant. But the whole concept of its economic model means you need to have fleets of these. And they have a factory where you're building them, you're fueling them, or refueling them, or refurbishing them, or decommissioning them. And on the left, you have a connection to a fuel supply with mining, with fuel manufacturing. and depending on the fuel cycle, potentially reprocessing. And you have an ultimate disposal of that waste in a deep geological repository. And the blue arrows indicate all of the pathways where nuclear materials are being transported. So what is among the challenges here? Well, just think about the footprint for that SMR system and the implicated jurisdictions: international, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, First Nations. My head hurts. And you think every one of those points is an engagement requirement, not an opportunity, a requirement. There's our indigenous communities as rights holders. There's hosted and impacted communities. There's owners, there's operators, there's license agreements, and there's regulatory licenses. This perspective is enormously important. It can be done, but one has to think about that system concept from the birth of the idea. To wrap this piece up here, I want to come back to a comment I made earlier, and that is, if you want nuclear to be a big player in the global energy system transition, which is certainly my thesis here, we're talking about many. And if you want to get to many, the business models that worked for the first big nuclear build out of the 70s through the 90s probably won't work. And we have to come back and fundamentally rethink the business models, operating models, and our social license to do so. We're into and briefly, markets. This is no longer just about large base load for large grids as the key theme of mine. However, these markets are emerging or nascent. It's about fleets. It's about economies of multiples. It's about borders. No longer can we afford the jurisdictional infighting and everybody approving their own designs and doing their own thing. We need something like the Auto Pact for North America when it comes to nuclear in North America. It's about the externalities. I'm going to come back about this in a moment. There are many externalities, waste being one, that for many energy sources are not internalized, they are for nuclear. It's about a level playing field. It's about investment, responsible investment. A key element for nuclear is one-for-one replacement with coal and gas plants as they come to the end of their operational life. Same footprint, same energy output. And it's about the whole workforce requirement. Importantly, it's also about engagement, something that our industry has not done well and was largely not a requirement during the first big build of the 70s to 90s. But it is a reality today. We have a nuclear hesitant public. It's about host communities, indigenous rights holders, investors, energy decision makers, on and on and on. Which brings me to my last point, and I'll just briefly speak to this because it's, in my mind, enormously important, and that is the public hesitancy to nuclear energy. And you look at in today's context about where one gets one's information, how one discusses these topics, what is truth, who do you trust? It is an enormously difficult space. Rob, I don't envy you in your political life. It is a contact sport and it is a challenge. When it comes to nuclear, we have a whole lot of misunderstanding of our industry out there. I'm going to give you 2 slides here with what I call the 10 myths of nuclear energy. I just took this off the web. This is from one of the big US national labs, the Argonne National Lab in Chicago. And here's its 10 points. Every one of these statements, I expect at one point or other you've heard, such as nuclear energy is bad for the environment, or most Americans don't support nuclear energy, and American Chernobyl will kill thousands of people. And it goes at length to explain why these are myths. A second is from the World Nuclear Association that tackles directly the issue around waste. You see the first bullet: nuclear industry has no solution for the waste problem. That's actually the anti-nuclear message, and they have succeeded enormously effectively in getting that message out as truth. There's another argument, and you run down the list here. we could have a debate around this. The point here is that we have a lot of sources of information that says nuclear is a problem. Nuclear has its problems. It's good to be able to focus on what those actually are. I want to then give you Bob's list of 10 facts about nuclear. It's already been hinted at. You look at about the GHG, life cycle GHG emissions per unit energy produced. Nuclear is better than wind and solar. Over 50 years of nuclear power, by not having to burn fossil fuels, nuclear has actually avoided premature deaths of millions of people around the world. It has saved lives. Its capital costs are high, yes, but when you combine that with its operating costs, its low fuel costs, its long plant lifetimes, it's among the lowest cost electricity generating technologies today, even with the cost of new renewables going lower and lower. In terms of death incurred through the generating technologies life cycle, yes, we've got Fukushima and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. You include all of that, it's got the best safety record of all generating technologies, including wind and solar. And let me get real controversial here. It is the only generating technology today that's internalized the cost of managing its waste. When Bruce Power is paid for the electricity generated at its generating station, included in that cost is the cost to dispose of its waste. And here is another very controversial point, but its volume of toxic waste is the lowest of all generating technologies, including wind and solar, by orders of magnitude. It has got the least use of natural resources by orders of magnitude. It has the smallest land use by orders of magnitude. Yes, there is some ionizing radiation that comes from these plants, but it is extremely small. In fact, the average radiation dose to the public from nuclear power is about equivalent of eating 1 banana per year. Having said that, the reality is the public doesn't trust nuclear energy. And I would argue that part of that, it comes back to the reality of how we're regulated. I've got 2 slides left here. If you go back to something we're all very familiar with today, COVID and approval of vaccines, and the role of the regulator on behalf of the public good to do 2 things: determine whether the vaccine is safe and whether the vaccine is effective. It's a balance between risk and benefit to the public good. Yes, there's always the fine print and what it says is safe and what is effective, something we've had enormous dialogue around the world on. But people understand the role of the regulator and by and large respect that. What happens in the case of nuclear? A very regulated industry. What does the regulator do? Determines whether proponent's nuclear energy project is safe. Doesn't speak at all to the benefit. In fact, speaking to the benefit is the responsibility of the proponent. So you got industry having to go to the public and say, I've got a great project, I'm safe, and you want it. And the reality is then you come into those that are opposed and for, it's a tilted playing field. And I would say that when you bring into the benefit that contributes to net zero, you have the potential to change the equation in a substantial way. One thing that I've learned through my work with the think tank at University of Ottawa, which is largely social scientists, is that we're an industry that hasn't paid enough attention to what social scientists are saying. And that we see around the world today a general erosion in the public's trust of experts. This tendency to see debate in the Western democracies increasingly politicized, polarized, and with partisanship. The public wants to be involved in decisions that are directing them, that are impacting them directly. We see the echo chambers of social media the tendency of everybody, myself included, for what is called motivated reasoning. We'll look at new evidence and accept it or reject it based on our pre-existing worldviews. And you talk about rationality in decision making. Something a social scientist has said to me is that, well, you say nuclear energy is safe, yet you're going to bury your waste a kilometer underground. Surely the public is saying this must be the most dangerous stuff there is. All this comes back to my final point, is that there's a compelling need for new approaches to what the Supreme Court of Canada calls meaningful consultation. The problem is not a knowledge deficiency, it is a trust challenge. And with that, Rob, I'll pass back to you.
Bob, thanks very much. You have touched upon the need to make sure that, in particular, small modular reactors, but more generally, the sector is cognizant of new rules of public engagement, social license or social contract, making sure that it's also situated within a broader conversation about the diversification of Canada's energy portfolio, and in fact, the global energy portfolio, one that's getting increased attention. And certainly the political scientist in me was smiling as really we're talking about the significance of federalism among other institutions that define Canada, as it will affect and impact these conversations. And so I guess I would go to a conversation that Dr. Henry Kissinger was asked in a question. And the question was pretty simple. From the time you started advising governments to today, what's changed? He said, when I started, I used to be asked how government should think about problems. And today I'm asked what they should say about problems. And Bob, you've helped us think very carefully and very clearly through some of the challenges, also some of the opportunities that are associated with SMRs. And I'll now just turn to Klaus. I'm looking forward to this conversation on fusion. Dr. Hiroshi at the University of Saskatchewan helped me when I was very young, took me down to the tokamak reactor, the basement of the physics building, and provided my kind of fusion 101. And so I'm looking forward to this update and really its contribution as we continue to hear important insights. And today, I feel like we've got a front row seat. Klaus, I'll turn it to you.
First of all, thank you very much, Perry, for giving us the opportunity to speak here. I very much enjoyed the first two speakers, and I just wanted to make clear that my objective here is not to start a fusion-fission cage match, but just to show how the two can be working together, because there's an awful lot of things that are similar here, and there are a few differences that I believe make it worthwhile to invest in fusion to take it to the next step. So my name's Klaus Rodenberg. I'm the Fusion Energy Council of Canada Communication Chair. So I am by no means an expert in nuclear or fission or fusion, but have been involved with the council for the last decade or so, starting in Alberta with the Alberta Energy Council, and now going Canada-wide. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from. So first of all, just kind of talk about why fusion. And I think I'm going to skip over a lot of the things that have already been said, so I don't think we have to get into a lot of it, but I will touch on a few things that have been said already. But basically, we see fusion as a safe, low carbon, unlimited source of energy. It's got the highest density of any demonstrated energy source. Its fuel source is generally available everywhere, so it's not geopolitical. Access to clean and affordable energy raises our global standard of living. And where we're probably a little bit different here is that there's fusion has no long-term radioactive waste, no meltdown risks, and no security risk, which before has really been stuck in terrorism, making sure that stuff doesn't come into the hands of the wrong people, or in war in terms of proliferation of weaponization. And now what we've seen in the Ukraine is people actually shooting at these plants. And this was not something that they were quite prepared for. Again, this has been said before in the earlier ones. We do have to look at global energy. 80% of it comes from fossil fuels, and we somehow have to bring the scenario down by reducing the amount that we use and set up. The low carbon alternatives are efficiency. You don't get emissions out of anything you don't burn. Renewables, as has been talked about already, in terms of wind, solar, and geothermal. I've added in carbon capture and utilization, and this I see as a bridging technology in terms of stopping the carbon from hitting the atmosphere in the first place. And then, of course, we've got the fission and the fusion. We've just gone through the fission, so people are pretty well aware of the benefits and how that can be done. And I'm just going to focus on the fusion and how that fits into all of this. Just an interesting slide that keeps coming up as I go through, and it's just comparing a coal-fired power plant of 1,000 megawatts and what it would take to have a comparable output from a fusion plant. And of course, the thing that always scared me was the fact that a coal-fired power plant needs about 90 rail hopper cars every day to keep it going, to keep that energy going. At the same time, it produces 30,000 tons of CO2, 600 tons of SO2, and 80 tons of NOx and those type of things, plus some other things. So it's not just the greenhouse gases that we're concerned about. In theory, a similar plant fusion plant would use about 6 pounds of deuterium, 1.8 pounds of lithium, or 0.8 pounds of tritium, and would produce 2 pounds of helium and a bunch of neutrons, which is where the energy comes from in terms of where to do it. I just kind of stole this on one of our trips. At the bottom here, that says a cubic kilometer of seawater has enough deuterium in it to exceed the total world oil reserves. So just kind of an interesting thing to do. What is fusion? It's basically, it's the fusion of a hydrogen nuclei, very similar to the way our sun works and the stars. And of course, you want to do the marketing thing of the choice of nature and the greenest. What we're really starting to see now is the difference. There's been this big issue about, well, not an issue, but if we're getting into myths, that fusion is the fuel of the future, and it always will be. But there's been some real updates that I hope to present here that look like there'll be some form of fusion energy hitting the grid by the 2030s. Now, these may be optimistic, and it's where it sits, but I think we can really see progress here to move. So just a quick thing about how fusion works. And we're on the other side of the periodic table. Instead of the heavy elements, we're on the light elements. And it's basically, instead of splitting atoms, we're trying to fuse them together. And this would be deuterium, which is water with an extra neutron, or tritium, which is extra heavy water. Put it into, fuse it, and get the outcome of helium and neutrons, which is where the energy comes from. You can have a look at the numbers yourself. I have no idea what they actually mean, but I'm assuming that they have been vetted and set up, because I know every time I put a number out, Alan Offenberger's all over me, making sure that all this stuff is factual and defendable. There's two main approaches. There's also some hybrid approaches now that we can start to look at. But basically, you look at magnetic, which is a way of taking the fuel cells, putting it into a stream of charged particles and keeping them in place using magnets. And that's by far right now where most of the investment is going, as well as the one thing that we're very interested in here in Alberta is the inertial, which comes where you basically talk about another driver, in particular, when you look at the National Ignition Facility in California, where they're using laser beams to smush the things together and come up with a burn. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as we go through. So on the inertial side, which is the laser side, the one that is the leading this area is the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore, California, just outside of San Francisco. And I have visited this, and they do take tours, and you can have a look at it. Very big facility, $5 to $7 billion, which in Alberta doesn't scare us in terms of the oil sands and the kind of investments being made there. But you can see on the building is that there's a football length of 192 lasers that they use. I don't know why 192 and not 190 or 193. That's what they came up with. And what it does is, if you look at the little picture of the eye, there's a 2 millimeter fuel cell. And this is what those lasers are hitting simultaneously in order to get that reaction and get that burn going. I showed again the chamber where this happens, and it's kind of cool because they used it as the what I showed in the first slide. This was great for the movie Star Trek reboot as the engine room for the Enterprise. So, but it goes to the complexity of the fusion. And one of the things that's often quoted to me is that fission is easy to start and hard to stop, and fusion is very difficult to start but easy to stop. So this is kind of the difference between it. So I don't want to downplay the complexity of making this stuff happen, but if nothing else, at least we have these facilities to make movies on. So it goes from there. In terms of magnetic, the poster child right now is ITER, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. It's huge. It's now hit $22 billion. This may now be euros and that sort of things. It's being built in Cardache, France. It's nearing completion. So in next year or two, we should be able to get some of the first experiments out of there. And you can see the reactor that's over there. And I'm not sure if you can see the little guy standing underneath, but it's a mega project in terms of where to go. So we're truly talking both the NIF and the ITER as big science. That's really what we're looking at here. Now, progress, the NIF facility just recently, we're talking August, did a experiment which they call a shot, and it was in the zone of a completed burn. So you can see all the little shots that they've taken over the years and over time, and that curve there is the sweet zone that they're aiming for to get a burn to happen. Now, remember that this is only a burn on a single one of those little targets. So, but that's where you need to start to move forward. On the magnetic side, the JET, Joint European Torus, achieved a record fusion energy using their tokamak. And this tokamak is a smaller version of the ITER. So this is where the experiments will go that will feed the the stuff for ITER as it comes online. And they ended up at 59 megajoules. And there's some, sorry, some places that they can't go too much further just because they can't go past 5 seconds and that sort of thing. But anyways, there was enough energy there to heat up 100 tea kettles. So we can make some tea now to make that go, to set it up. But again, major improvement. On the more still magnetic, but we're now starting to talk about commercial, not big institutions, big science, but smaller companies that are starting to work up. And this is the Commonwealth Fusion Systems. One of the people there is on our advisory board, and they were interested in improving the peak performance of the magnets, and they were able to get 20 Teslas, and they feel that they can bring it further. What this does is it makes for the tokamak to be smaller and still get the same performance out of it, which of course reduces the costs and the ability to commercialize. In terms of, I just took out the Canada numbers. In terms of academia, there's still, even though there's no fusion program in Canada, there's still an awful lot of work being done at the U of A, as well as the University of Saskatchewan, Toronto, Ontario Tech University, Queens, CNL for the tritium, OPG, again, for supplier of tritium fuel, and General Fusion in Burnaby, which is becoming an expert in confinement because they're actually getting enough shots there to start looking at that. It's an iterative process. So the whole idea, and I'm going to use a Canadian metaphor, is the idea is to take more shots, or more shots on the net, that I'm going to tell the Oilers tonight, is take more shots on the net so that you can score some goals. And what you can see on the right side is the ITER, a huge one, the jet that we talked about earlier, and the Spark, which is the Commonwealth tokamak in Boston. This is the one I just showed at the previous slide. And how, again, you could see that if you look at the Spark or the CMOD, you can get a lot more shots in because this is a much smaller tokamak, and it can be built cheaper and it can be used more often. They haven't taken a shot in ITER, and they've been in construction for the last 10 years, sort of thing. So the idea is to get more shots, learn faster, and cheaper. So that brings us to a path forward in commercialization. And this is from the fusion industry to set up. There's now about 35 companies that are starting to get into, around the world, that are starting to get into fusion and are starting to come up with some things. USA is still one of the leaders, as is the UK. But as you can see there, is that private sector investments are close to 1.8 billion, and only about 80 million coming from public funding, sort of thing. To me, this is a great step forward because it means we can move faster to do things. Same place, you can see that not everybody's into electricity generation. There are other things that you can look up as well, sort of like space propulsion, which is probably why Jeff Bezos is interested in it, medical areas, hydrogen and clean fuels, which is what Edmonton is very interested in their hub, and those type of things. Industrial heat, again, very important when you start talking steel and concrete. And you can see the investors that have been investing in there. One of the things that's interesting here is Cenovus, which is one of the Alberta oil sands companies, has invested in General Fusion and is very well aware of this type of thing to go. Again, one of the things I like to push on, it's not just about energy. There's also, this is complex, really cool technology, and it has lots of spin-off opportunities in medical, in materials handling, in theoretical physics. You saw the batteries and that sort of thing, non-destructive testing. This thing on the Revitalization comes from the French LMJ, and it's basically the same as the National Ignition Facility. And what they did, which was kind of good, is they built an accelerator for all these new innovative products right beside the plant that they needed to put materials in. So they had a cash injection from the LMJ buying their materials, and then an opportunity to commercialize it for other industries. And where it sits, it might be a model worthwhile for us to look at. And then sort of my last slide here is just some of the enabling technologies, which I think just have other opportunities for people to be innovative and to set it up. One of the big ones that Alan Offenberg is talking about, because this is his area of expertise, is lasers and applications. But we're also talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking Amy here in Edmonton, robotics, healthcare, nanotechnologies, just consulting. We are very good at, in Canada and Alberta, at construction management and setting those things up. So really, this is what my message here is: fusion is worthwhile investing in. The more we invest, the better outcomes we're likely to have. And let's go from there. There's a whole slew of more detailed and technical stuff that we can get into in the future, but this is kind of my message today. So thank you very much to Kincaid Enterprises for allowing us to do this. Join us at the fusionenergy.ca. There'll be more detail, more stuff that you could have a look at. And we're also planning a fusion symposium in 2023. So if anybody has some ideas, we'll get more of that information out as we go. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm, again, with the other people, more than happy to answer any questions.
Well, thanks very much for a deep dive into fusion. You've touched on not simply the evolution of technology, but you've also spoken about and highlighted the significance of the private sector jumping in. When we think about the urgency that Bob has mentioned, that notion of speed to market certainly again speaks to an opportunity for Canada, if not in isolation, then at least with partners to help play a leadership role in this promising area of endeavor. Conscious of our time, and I'd like to just open it up for questions. We've had an overview and then a couple of deep dives. You can see some obvious synergies between the presentations and obvious points where we need to explore a little bit more. There are other disciplines that are going to become involved, including how we frame, speak about, and ultimately act on the opportunities associated with nuclear energy. So I'm happy to see a show of hands and begin the questions and hopefully get some really interesting, insightful responses.
I'm delighted that a bunch of advances are occurring both in the fission and in the fusion space. Obviously, fission is closer to commercialization. And you know, there was a discussion of the fear or the trust and issues that are inhibitors. In our hugely divisive world that looks for perfect solution and doesn't seem to be willing to even accept the tiniest smidgen of risk, how do we get through that? I struggle to figure out how we get through that. I'd welcome anybody's comments on that.
So thanks, Yogi. Look, there's so many areas where this reality of the divisive nature of public discourse, the echo chambers of social media, the loss of our ability to engage in critical thinking. It is, we haven't yet understood how to catch up and deal with social media, for example. I think in the political sphere, that's enormously the case. And that plays to this theme of new ways of engaging and new discussions. And I actually think that what Canada's doing around Indigenous reconciliation is probably one of the greatest lessons for the world of how to try to get this right, and move forward from that. And it is also in the energy space. There's another phenomenon occurring here, Yogi, that I'd highlight, and that if you look at the history of opposition to nuclear energy, you'll say, well, Bob, here you go generalizing. I will generalize that the vocal community opposed to nuclear energy tends to share my gray hair. If you go to the students coming out of universities, the people that are inheriting the mess that we have left to them, they are open to solutions that solve the climate crisis and are prepared to look at every solution that may be there. So my sense is that learning from Indigenous reconciliation, engaging our youth by putting into our universities and our colleges and giving them the opportunity to hear what the pros and cons of various solutions are all going to be passed to the future. And recognizing in the meantime, we're going to have this chatter, we're going to have this he said, she said, they're wrong, he's right. It's going to be part of the discourse, and it's almost like ignoring the move beyond it. And really, it's about, I think, letting the new generation of youth come forward, the ones that are inheriting the problem, really come at this problem not with the old baggage of nuclear is bad or whatever, and come there and say, we need every solution in our toolbox that can actually solve this crisis. Am I dreaming in Technicolor? Perhaps I am. But at the end of the day, I think the climate emergency can be a global unifying message if we give it a chance. And so much of this is about the youth.
You mentioned our what we've been doing with our Indigenous peoples as a template or example of what can be done well. Can you drill down just a few ideas on, add some color to that, please?
Yeah, so the one that, the area that I think we're seeing enormous progress on is that in the energy sector, and this is right across, whether it's wind, solar, renewables, whether it's hydro, whether it's nuclear, we are actually approaching our Indigenous rights holders as equity holders in solutions that give them economic opportunity and voice at the table. In fact, votes at the table. And it's not, therefore, this mindset that we've got Indigenous communities, they've got, energy insecurity. What are we doing to support them? They actually have strengths. They're business people. They have abilities to be part of the energy transition. They want to be. They're going to make their own choices of which technologies they favor. But I think this is an enormous positive. And we're seeing that change in attitude towards our Indigenous peoples as business peoples, as rights holders, as equity holders. And I think this is plays well to the future.
You noted a very interesting dichotomy of the role of the regulatory bodies in ensuring safety and effectiveness. But that doesn't seem to be applying in the nuclear sector, meaning industry needs to step into the to make the argument and to provide the leadership, to educate the public, to engage in the reconciliation processes. Why is government not playing a leadership role?
Well, so first off, I will make the observation. What I'm talking about is we've gotten to where we are through a whole lot of historical journey that the rest of the world has also followed, that nuclear carries risks and we can't trust the industry to do it themselves. We need to regulate it. And that's a reality. And I think it's time we came back and had that conversation about a regulatory system that actually more tracks the public health reality here, Perry. That to me is a very profound discussion to have. Those of you connected with oil and gas would know about how Canada's energy regulator has struggled in this space. And I, for one, think we need more of a discussion where the public good around energy decision making is looked at through a larger lens than the safety lens. That would be extremely helpful, I think. Now, yes, Rob made the comment, there's not a more complicated system of federalism than Canada. I mean, who decides on energy projects? A number of hands go up immediately. I decide. Well, the reality is every project seems to have a whole gaggle of decision makers. It would seem to me some way of providing frameworks where engagement with stakeholders and consultations and pulling the oars in the same direction would be extremely beneficial. And my view is that one of the greatest things we could get out of Canada, if we can make SMRs work in Canadian jurisdiction, they can work anywhere in the world.
In our decarbonization series, over and over and over again, regulatory reform, a new view of the institutional roles in these dialogues came up, as if technology is moving so fast that the government's institutional structures are unable to keep up, to fulfill the regulatory role. When technology moves as fast as it is, I'm not surprised at the slow rate at which democracy arrives at decisions is being confronted by the rapid rate of change. There are places in the world that have simply given up, like China, saying, look, the party knows best, you just be compliant, follow us, we'll set the regulation without consultation. But that's not our system. And our challenge is how to engage in reconciliation when things are moving so quickly.
One thing with the regulator, which I've been quite pleased with, is they've done these, they have 10 reactor vendors, small modular reactors. They are now undergoing a sort of pre-review of their technology. And this is a good step forward. So they're not providing all the details and going forward with the final design and now waiting for a couple of years for the whole review to go forward. They're doing these preliminary reviews. And so the CNSC is able to say, you need to work more on this area. This is important. You need to cover this more and more experiments perhaps, or technology development in that area. And I thought that was a really good move on their part, that they aren't ready to, none of these vendors are ready to present their license case to the CNSC, but they're not going in blind, so to speak. They are now able to present, when they are ready for that, they're able to present a design with which the CNSC is already somewhat familiar. So I thought that was a very good move on their part.
I agree with Bob, is that it's coming down to trust, and there's a lack of it. And I really like the term that he used, meaningful consultation. We don't seem to be able to sit down and actually have meaningful confrontation, because if I'm right and you're wrong, sort of thing. And just as science is very much that way now, is that people expect perfect from science, is that this is the solution that will solve everything, where in fact, science is not about solutions, but about questions and getting that up. And I've really been enjoying some of the Brian Cox podcasts and he's a physicist that is responsible for the UK's communication of science, and this whole idea that, you know, science is about changing your mind, coming up with better things, coming up, but people, and again, I don't want to generalize, but the loud people seem to not be able to understand this, that changing your mind and coming up with a better one is a good thing.
Axel, I don't see your hand, but I gather that you want to make a comment or have a question.
I was going to ask a technical question, but since we're since we're on trust, let me just make a comment. The trust in matters, in all types of matters nuclear, has been largely impaired by events outside Canada. It's been impaired by Three Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, etc. So whatever we do in the nuclear field, we have to recognize that what we do inside the country is only a partial response to building trust. We have to engage with others outside the country. I think early on, Bob was saying that the attitudes of people with gray hair or no hair, and I call myself, to nuclear is different from younger people. And I ask myself, why is that so? It's likely so because people with gray or no hair have actually experienced in Canada, albeit at a distance, real problems with nuclear. And younger people have not yet. Now, hopefully there won't be another incident anywhere in the world to impair that trust. But I think we just have to be mindful of the fact that in today's age, trust is built not only inside your own country and what you do inside your own country, but also what happens outside the country and how that is then interpreted. So the nuclear community in the global sense has a joint responsibility for advancing, explaining, and engaging with people everywhere. So it'd be interesting to know, to hear from our speakers what they think about the international dimension of building trust and how that's reflected inside Canada.
In the nuclear industry, there is a saying: a nuclear accident anywhere is a nuclear accident everywhere. And one of the innovations that occurred after Chernobyl is what's called the World Association of Nuclear Operators. And every operating plant, all 400 plus operating plants of nuclear plants around the world, are members. And the requirement there is to have a safety record that far exceeds requirements of regulators. And I, as a president of ACL, have experienced the finger in the chest critique by WANO peer reviews coming into facilities at Chalk River to say, your safety standards aren't where they need to be. Here's what you need to do. It's all to the theme here. And the reality is trust isn't an input, it's an output. And it's the consequences of those experiences. And I expect a part of it is that if you've lived TMI and Chernobyl and Fukushima, that you're colored by this. Part of the problem we have here is coming back and understanding just what transpired in those accidents and trying to understand what the implications of them were versus what the media and the anti-nuclear community has portrayed them as. If one looks at the criterion that would occur in any other industry, such as fatalities caused by the incident, then by any standard, these were not the accidents that in terms of loss of life, they had enormous economic disruption. Certainly Fukushima in Japan. But the reality is we lose sight immediately when you talk of Fukushima that 15,000 Japanese died from the tidal waves, including failures of a number of hydro dams, and nobody died from radiation. But so it is about, and this plays back to perception, it plays back to social media, it's who you trust that you're getting your information from. My head hurts. I'm not a social scientist, but boy, do I spend a lot of time listening to social scientists. Thank you, Axel.
The Canadian Gas Association and what was formerly called the Canadian Electricity Association, now called Electricity Canada, have requested the convention of a national, federal, provincial, and territorial task force on reducing regulatory legislative barriers to getting to net zero. So those are two large players, the power sector and the natural gas sector, production, transmission, distribution in both. And I'm sure they'd be open to hearing from the nuclear sector, because obviously nuclear could be part of that solution set, either fission or fusion or both.
Just a comment, actually, going back with nuclear safety is my own subset of specialty. That's what I work with every day, is something called severe accidents, which involve accidents like TMI, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. And actually, a lot of people don't seem to realize that Canada was #1 with having a severe accident at the River site, December 12, 1952. And we had quite a serious accident. It didn't cause any fatalities or any injuries whatsoever. When the reactor actually went over power, about 3 times over power in a few seconds. It was rapidly shut down. That was the end of the accident. There was cleanup after that. And we learned a great deal from that in 1952. The reactor was completely rebuilt. I remain absolutely amazed that from the time of the accident until restart was 14 months. Right now, we couldn't even get the draft safety report out in 14 months on what happened. It's interesting, though, that accident happened and it didn't have any huge effects, produced some waste products, which we are still dealing with some of that legacy today. But that reactor accident taught us a great deal. That fellow I showed you, George Lawrence, who did that early work in Canada, he actually became the head of the Atomic Energy Control Board, which was the predecessor of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And he was very keen on learning from that accident that we would have separated shutdown systems and multiple ways of stopping the fission process. And that actually put, it really stuck a finger to our chests, so to speak, as an industry in Canada, that we learned from that. And so actually we learned less perhaps from 3 Mile Island than we might have otherwise without that accident. However, one thing I think of often is that if that accident happened today, that, in Canada, that could be perceived as the end of the nuclear industry in Canada, kind of thing, because of the way our society has changed its views on things. As someone pointed out, we are so paranoid about things, absolute safety we want, even though that's a fiction. And if we had that NRX accident today, it could be the end of at least the R&D side of nuclear in Canada, because people would have such a bad perception of it, even though the accident itself was relatively small, much smaller than TMI and the other big severe accidents we've seen in the world.
Rob, I'll give you the license or the latitude to make any summary comments, and then I'll introduce where we're headed with our next webinar.
Perry, thanks very much. I think the conversation about trust is one that social scientists are paying a lot more attention to, but so are engineers, so are chemists, so are epidemiologists. We're seeing that it isn't an on-off switch. There are high trust, medium trust, and low trust institutions, entities, countries, political cultures. And we have a mighty challenge in front of us where we would live in a relatively high trust society with high trust institutions being exposed through social media at a constant flow of events occurring in low trust countries and institutions. And it's very difficult for us to really make sense of that. And we can think about questions that are going to be raised around not the first Chernobyl, but the shelling and the incidents that have occurred during the Russian invasion. We've got our work cut out. And I think that question about trust is, I think it's prescient about being able to deploy and employ future technologies. And we've had them highlighted to here today. It's less about technology, and it is far more about that social license, or a term I prefer, social contract. And Bob, you really helped us visualize one of the challenges in the deliberations, and that is there's a gap, structural gap, where proponents need to make the case, and we need more analysis like that to say, let's make sure there's a level playing field. Let's make sure there are entities and institutions within our high trust society that can help us to have very, very clear delineations on risk mitigation, and ultimately rewards. Because the path forward, if we think about the climate and carbon conundrum that we're into, it's not going to make sense in a risk-averse or risk-free environment. So I've just appreciated the opportunity to participate today, and most especially to learn.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you all for joining us today. Axel, I will once again credit you for having set this up with your comments, concluding the last webinar of the impact of the war on Canada and energy. But I also have to go back to, I think it was Mark Summers during the decarbonization series, who was pointing out at that time that our communications in the world today have become hyper emotional. And the presentation of facts gets caught up in things like conspiracy theory and misinformation. And in a world where 5 billion people seem to have the confidence that they're going to get heard, has changed the world from one where you dealt with cohorts or groups, and you could say, I can please all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time. You can never please anybody all the time anymore. So I say thank you all to what we've done this season. And I want to note that our next webinar on May 19th is focused on leadership, restoring trust in the face of relentless chaos. And this covers literally everything we've done this year, whether it was climate change, nuclear, the war, the forces and sources of change all seem to be confronting this fact that where is the leadership that will give people a sense of trust and confidence that they can believe in, that they will be listened to. And Bob, I'd like to talk to you offline a little bit further, a couple of your slides, because it seems to be you've given some pretty deep thought to this as it relates to nuclear. But my takeaway or my feed to you is this is a lot broader, and it is not unique to nuclear. This is a fundamental problem of society.